the pollen is high protein and these oils and things that the bees need as part of their diet, and especially for the brood, because the brood is what really needs the protein to build their bodies. And people have been eating bee pollen for thousands of years. We know that the Greek athletes, back in the times of the empire, the Greek Empire, ate bee pollen. Now, when they eat bee pollen, they ate pollen in the comb. And we'll get to that, why that's different. But nowadays, people can trap pollen. And what they generally go, a pollen trap goes on a Langstroth box, and you set it right on top in lieu of the bottom board or between the bottom board and the brood box. And it's a little device that has screens, 5 wires to the inch above where the bees come in, so that the bees have to go through, and 7 wires to the inch below where the pollen grains, they get knocked off the bees' legs when they come up through the 2 wires at 5 wires to the inch. It knocks the pollen off their legs. It falls down through the 7 wires to the inch screen down below and into a drawer. And the beekeeper, really in the hot weather we've got now, the beekeeper should virtually collect that pollen once a day. And even then it gets a little bit iffy, because pollen is a very delicate substance once it's free from the bees, and the bees can't preserve it because of the fatty acids and the warm temperatures. And then the fact that wax moths can drop eggs and hive beetles can drop down into the pollen trap and lay eggs. Mm-hmm. You've got a highly susceptible substance that is high in protein, quick to rot or to mold or to begin feeding wax moth or beetle larvae. And then there's the question of, do the bees get damaged when they're scraping themselves through these small spaces that knocks the pollen off their legs? And the answer is yes. We know that bees damage their wings a little bit, or their legs. Often their legs have fairly delicate structures on them to rake up and collect pollen. And when they have to pull them through this fine wire, they often get a little bit damaged. Now, what is the incentive? Well, the incentive is that you can sell bee pollen for a fairly high price, but you need to harvest it daily. I would put it right in the freezer immediately, because you need to kill the wax moth larvae and the beetle larvae that might have gotten started already. Kill the eggs.
So I have a question. Last, when you freeze it, does it destroy any of the properties of the live cultures that are in the bee bread?
Well, probably, although it's not being made into bee bread yet. If you knock it off, they're starting a little bit, but if you knock it off their legs before they get it in the comb, it's pretty much just raw pollen. There's inevitably some of the good fungus that the bees are carrying on their bodies that might begin trying to protect that pollen. But, and then there's another interesting thing. When you look at the pollen coat, there's a serious sphere that contains the DNA that is the actual pollen, in a sense, a sperm cell for a plant. And then there's the coatings on the outside, the antigens around the outside. Turns out that if you eat a bunch of bee pollen and check on it after it's passed through the human digestive tract, the pollen coat is not affected by our digestion. So we don't access a lot of the nutrition in the pollen when we just eat it raw. Whereas if you let bees put it away, they inoculate it with a fungus that is acid loving, and they soak the pollen and the fungus in honey, which is acidic, and it creates the perfect conditions for that fungus to grow, and it cracks the pollen coat. Our digestive system can't do that, but this fungus, this beneficial fungus, can. So it makes it much more rich in terms of our digestible nutrition that we can get out of it. But to get back to the pollen traps, you should take the pollen off, freeze it, potentially denature it a little bit, dry it, because if it stays humid, it's just going to rot on you as soon as you turn your back, because it's very delicate stuff. And then you want to put it in a jar and sell it. And you can sell it for some reasonable amount of money. But I've always looked at it as a dangerous substance to harvest, because I've read articles written back in the day, in the 80s. There was a pollen company that recommended you buy their pollen traps, of course, and put a pollen trap on every hive. That your hive would make more honey if it had the pollen trap on it than if it had it off.
Well, that doesn't make any sense.
It didn't make any sense. Dr. Albert Jaycox was a bee scientist back in those days that liked to debunk advertising. So he did a study, and he found that it made anywhere from 20 to 30% less honey when you had a pollen trap on the beehive. They recruited more pollen carriers because they weren't getting enough pollen. So the bees absolutely must have pollen to raise brood. And if they don't get enough pollen, they'll recruit more and more pollen carriers until they do. So taking the pollen from them has a cost to the health of the beehive. And then the bees also found ways. For instance, I found that when I used pollen traps, or when I worked for people that use pollen traps back in the 80s, I found that bees would exploit any other entrance into the beehive. Like in a top bar hive, if there's a little top bar broken or lifted or bowed a little bit and there's a crack big enough, the bees would start going out in and out of that crack and abandon the pollen trap, because they recognized that it was uncomfortable and was stripping their pollen. So they would use every other entrance they could find. So you'd have to tape everything shut and force them to use the pollen trap. Now, I did figure out how to put a pollen trap, a Langstroth pollen trap, on a top bar hive. It was easy to do. You just drill a great big hole in the bottom of the top bar hive, cover all the ways out any other way, and make the bees go through the pollen trap and into the top bar hive. And it could be done, but I didn't choose to do it except to show that it could be done, because by then I was already determined that these devices are not good for the bees.
Mm-mm.
And then if it turns out that pollen isn't as digestible after it's been trapped off the bees, unless when the bees bring it in, they bring it to certain cells that somehow get designated, and they kick the pollen off their legs into the cells. And you can see the little pellets just laying there on the top of the pollen that's been stored. And if you wait long enough, nurse bees or bees that's their job, and if we're working in the hive, come along and ram it with their heads and flatten those little pills nice and flat. And so that's why when you take pollen out of the comb, you can see layers. It's like strata that go back in time of the different pollens that they've collected over the course of that day or week. And once they fill that cell, it's never as full as honey. They always keep it a little bit empty. They soak the pollen with honey as they go. and they leave it open so it can breathe. And that becomes bee bread, which they can then store for quite a while, in spite of the fact that it was fairly susceptible to rot. So they have stabilized the fatty acids with the fungus, much like when we make cheese out of milk. We can get the cheese to last a lot longer than the raw milk. They have cracked the pollen coat and stabilized the interior. And now it's sitting there ready to pass through a drought or a winter and still offer some nutrition to the bees as they break into those cells later in the year when there isn't any flowers blooming and there isn't any pollen available. So pollen is a highly desired commodity that I would, there you go, there's a great picture of the layers of pollen that the bees have collected. It's a highly sought after commodity for the bees, highly needed by the bees, and it is also very nutritious to beekeepers. But I never took very much of it because I felt guilty about taking away their pollen. I would occasionally come to a comb that they had just built, because often in top bar beekeeping, I open up, I move the brood combs and I put a empty top bar right behind the very front comb. And that's like just getting on the front end of the brood nest to let them build a fresh new comb that might then become part of the brood nest. And that way I keep fresh comb. And if a hive is really building up fast, I want to give them as much chance to build wax as possible if I'm trying to limit swarming until I can get ready to make a divide. And often that comb is in the right position, right at the front end of the brood nest, where they would store a lot of pollen in it. Sometimes you'd come to that comb second from the front, and it would be mostly pollen. If it was brand new, and it was early in the spring, I might be tempted to take it and replace it with another new comb or another empty top bar. If I felt like there was lots and lots of pollen coming in, I wouldn't feel so terribly guilty about taking it. Put it right in the freezer, and then I would eat it, or I occasionally sold it, but I really felt like it was too high of a commodity for the bees to produce. I didn't know what to price it at. I'm sure that Natalie would have me pricing it at.
No, because I agree with you. I think that that's actually better for the bees to keep it on. But to your point about freezing it, what it does is that it makes the wax brittle. So you can kind of crack it once it's frozen, and that will separate the pellets, the bee bread pellets, from the wax. And then you can either dry freeze it and, keep it that way so you can consume it anytime. Or you can't, some people sell it. You can find it online actually, but it's like everything else. You don't know where that pollen is coming from, if those hives have been treated or anything. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is I agree with you. You just don't want to take the pollen from the bees because usually they're needed to build bee bodies, to grow more bees. But Les, is there, and I've got a couple questions, so I want to come back to my question afterwards, but I want to place it here so we don't forget. But is there such a thing as having too much pollen, and can it be pollen bound, which I've heard and I've seen before, but you can tell me about this. But first, I have a question from Kathy. She says she realized the queenless colony will still collect pollen, and she wants to know what they do with it if it's not to make bee bread. That's my question in the end. Are they thinking about when they go laying worker, maybe?
Yeah, so they will collect even a little bit of pollen with no brood, but very little. If you see a lot of pollen going into the beehive, there's pretty surely going to be some brood in that hive. If it is possible that there is quite a bit of drone brood if they're laying workers, and they might still. I don't know. I've not seen any like studies or anything showing the amount of pollen they bring in for a drone laying worker hive. But I think that's possible. That anytime they're feeding brood, they're going to be stimulated to go get pollen, even if it is drone brood and only drone brood.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority of the times that you see lots and lots of pollen going in, if you look in the hive, you're going to see quite a bit of worker brood or female brood being raised. When they're raising queen cells, they need a lot of pollen because the royal jelly is high protein.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to need a lot of pollen. So they'll recruit more pollen carriers. That's a variable thing. They can decide whether they need pollen carriers or nectar carriers or both. And if they're feeling like they need more pollen, they'll recruit more bees to carry pollen in. So, yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you, Les. I do have another question from Naveen. She's on as well on video. You can see her. She's saying, so am I getting this right? Bee bread is pollen with a cracked pollen coat soaked with honey and stabilized with fungus?
Right. And that's all done by the bees. They've been doing that ever since there's been bees and flowers. They've been collecting pollen and come across, pretty, the more you look at nature, the more amazing it gets. It's so complicated. And, what I'd like to point out is that this brings bees kind of to the peak of our ecological system, because as pollinators, they depend on millions of flowers, and they've come up with very ingenious ways to store the essence of the highly corruptible or stuff that can go bad easily or easily get robbed. They've come up with a way to store it for sometimes several years or many years and protect it from bears, mice, other humans, etc. All these kinds of creatures, from bacteria to viruses to fungus to you name it. And here they are still living, given the fact that we've poisoned so many of the flowers that they're trying to pollinate for us. Sometimes I think bees are hoping that we're going to rise to our ecological betterment, and they've kind of got our back in spite of the fact that we're poisoning them. They're hoping that we'll rise. I don't know. Time will tell whether we rise or fall.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll figure it out over time. I want to say hi to our apprentices. Naveen is one of them. And then we've got Brad, who's driving around in this big truck. I've got Dwayne also. So we have 3 of our apprentices on, and I'm glad to see you guys. Glad to see everybody's coming back and asking their questions. We've got Doug, Sarita, and Larry, Kathy, everybody that we've seen before, Margaret and Sherry, and the new people. Thank you. Denise has been there before. I think just about all of you, actually. So if you have questions, I wanted to remind you to ask them in the chat window. And I also want to say hi to Richard, who's joining us on Zoom live, on YouTube live, because he couldn't get on Zoom for some reason. So it's nice to see him. And the Bio Beekeeper is back. So thank you for joining us as well. We're happy to see you guys. Remember, this is your time to ask your questions, and we're here to help out. Again, the theme for tonight is pollen and bee needs with pollen and how they store it and all that stuff. So Les, with that, I have a question I wanted to bring up from Sarita and Larry. They were going to visit, let me see if I can find it again. They had a hive that swarmed a couple of months or so ago, and they decided to just watch and see what happened. They did manage to make another queen that they found a few weeks ago, and they just watched and waited to see what would happen. A couple of weeks ago, they checked again, and there was a poor brood pattern. So they crossed their fingers and hoped. And then last week when they checked, and that was 3 days ago, she sent out that email, there was no queen or brood to be found. We don't think there are enough bees left to support adding a frame of brood from another hive. So we're thinking our best plan is to just merge them with another hive. How do we get the bees that are hanging out on the bottom of the hive over to the new hive, which combining them, merging them is a great thing when you don't have any other options. Just cook them up, remove all the combs, and just hope they will find their way to another colony on their own. Any suggestions are very much appreciated. So Les, what is your take on that? And I think that they probably are on the right path about combining them and scooping them up and maybe leaving a comb behind to catch the stragglers and bring them over the new hive every day. What do you think?
I would try that once maybe, but mostly what I've done is I've even removed the hive, emptied the hive out, put the combs behind the other bees, or if you're in Langstroth's on the box above or whatever, and then taking the whole hive at the original site and set it somewhere else so that the bees that come back to that site can't find their way home. And I've seen them go and beg to be admitted into another hive. And they get a little worked over. Sometimes they get the fur chewed off their thorax a little bit. And then they get admitted to the new hive. And that's the best you can do, because I think you're probably wise in looking at that and realizing they're not strong enough to raise a new queen. Mm-hmm. And that you don't have that happens. It's not anything to take personally. Sometimes, most of the time when they swarm, you get a really great queen, but every once in a while something goes wrong, and we just have to take that in stride and not give up and try next year, later. Who knows? We have no idea what this weather pattern is going to be like. We could start getting into some small hurricanes and raininess coming up our way, and it could improve, or it could stay hot and dry. We have no idea.
Mm-hmm. So the bio beekeeper joined us a little bit after you were talking about trapping pollen on top of hives, and was wanting to know how you did that. And you mentioned a nifty little trick, using a pollen trap for Langstroth, right?
Yeah, this was back probably in the 80s. Mm-hmm. I just bought a Langstroth pollen trap that was about the size of a 10 frame to accommodate a 10 frame box. Set a top bar hive right on top of it, drilled about a 3-inch in diameter hole through the top bar hive, plugged up the entrance to the top bar hive, plugged up because the top bar hive at the bottom wasn't wide enough to cover the entire pollen trap. So I set it kind of off to one side, which I should have put it right in the middle, but I didn't. But at any rate, I was just a kid back then anyway, but covered it with boards. So now the bees had no choice but to go through the pollen trap and get out. They had a hard time with it at first, finding their way in. They would come back to where the entrance was, and it was really hard for them to figure out they had to go down into the pollen trap and come up through the pollen trap to get in. And then they pretty quickly found other ways out of the top bar hive that I had to plug up. But I eventually got them all forced to go through the pollen trap. But that's right away when I decided I was collecting wings in with the pollen, bee wings.
Aww.
That made me feel like, oh, I don't know if I like this. And so I didn't stick with it too long. I just proved it could be done. And there were beekeepers that, that was a big part of their business, was trapping pollen. And I learned a lot from them, because they found that by moving the trap from one hive to another, they'd get a bunch of pollen the first few days, and then it quickly diminish, and they would move it to another hive rather than leave it on that same hive, because they found that it would kind of drive the hive into the ground if they kept it on there too long.
Yeah, I've heard people using it alternating days, at least, because it's very taxing, right, on the colony?
Yeah. At least if you can turn them on and off, let the bees in for free, and then rather than lift it, because if you're putting a Langstroth hive on it, you got to lift it off, lift up the other Langstroth hive and put it underneath and put it all back together. That's a huge amount of work if they're making honey. So, and then, we also learned that pollen has very different flavors. We had pollen that was absolutely delicious. We had Russian olive pollen, very fragrant, very sweet, very delicious. And then right after it was tamarisk or salt cedar pollen, which is intensely bitter, almost inedible. I mean, hardly anybody would eat it. It tasted very, very bitter. And so, you can mix and match pollen if you timed it right. One of my favorite pollens back then was when the red purple sage pollen came in the fall, August, but it doesn't come in anymore. Climate change has pretty much taken that plant out of the desert. It was a plant that would grow about 2 or 3 feet tall, but if you got into a arroyo next to it where it was growing, at 11 feet below the plant, there was still a root about 3/4 of an inch in diameter going down into the ground. Very, very deep-rooted desert survivor, but it got to where it couldn't take the drought in New Mexico. So it's gotten very rare, but it made a very delicious red pollen that the bees absolutely loved. When that plant came into bloom, the bees put it everywhere. And that leads us into the pollen, overabundance of pollen in a beehive.
Pollen bound.
Getting to where they're pollen bound. Sometimes bees seem to get in a pollen frenzy where they just store so much pollen, you can't imagine how they're going to use all that pollen. They literally, now once it's there, it's hard to get out of there.
They can't do anything with it, right? So they're basically blocking their brood's nest, even worse than with nectar. That's a permanent blockage.
Right, and I'm not sure what inspires that in the bees, but I've seen that happen occasionally here in Texas, and occasionally somewhere in New Mexico with the purple sage pollen, where they really loved it so much, they just pack it in. And then it would kind of block them from being able to use those combs until they could eat it, which might be quite a while or maybe never.
Right. Well, I want to circle back to the pollen bound theme, or the pollen being stuck in the cells forever. But before that, I wanted to ask you a few questions. Sherry says, unless you mentioned if there's not enough pollen, they will have additional bees start collecting pollen. How do the bees know when it's time to change jobs?
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer. And I don't know anybody who knows the answer. There's a simple study that they did, experiment they did years ago. When bees are first born, they go through a stage where they develop very good mandibular and hypopharyngeal glands and become nurse bees. And they can really make lots of brood food. And then they get older and those glands begin to atrophy and they go to different jobs. So what they did is they took away a bunch of nurse bees from the hive so that the hive was short on brood feeders. When the field bees came back, the older field bees that had been nurse bees and already let their glands atrophy, when they came back, a certain number of field bees noticed somehow through the trophylactic exchange, I suspect, that the brood was starving and there weren't enough nurse bees. And they re-energized their hypopharyngeal and mandibular glands and became nurse bees again, almost as if they could go back in time and become young again. They weren't actually, they were still older bees, of course, but they did become nurse bees again. And once they got that back into balance, they kind of set it back into normal nature. But that's where we know that somehow this creature, this superorganism that's a bunch of little creatures combined to make one big creature, knows when there aren't enough of a certain type of bee, and somehow convinces individual bees to take on that job. And we don't know how that works. You know, it's I more and more believe that we are also a superorganism, and that we know when there's too many plumbers and not enough electricians, the plumbers get to where they don't have anything to do, and there's nutritionists saying, "Man, we need more help. Come on!" And finally, a plumber will go back and get retrained and become an electrician and start helping the electricians. So, how bees know this? That to me, now you're starting to get into the question of consciousness, which science doesn't really know what to do with. We can't measure consciousness. We can't weigh consciousness. We can't figure out its frequency or wavelength or anything like that. And yet we know that there seems to be a sense of purpose and consciousness, even in beehives. And that's, to me, that's the subject I'm the most fascinated with these days.
Yeah, so that does go into a question that I have from Naveen a little bit as well. But first, I wanted to mention the picture was for the hypopharyngeal glands in the head of the bees so that you could locate them, that we were sharing for a little bit. Then what is, Kathy's asking, why is it that the bees usually store pollen near the front of a tabar hive? I've occasionally seen brood on a comb further towards the middle with no pollen.
Right. So if you look at the bees 3D, if you can see so each comb is cutting through a 3D structure. And if you could watch how the bees make their brood nest, the brood nest tends to be radial, let's put it that way. It's not in a perfect world, it might be spherical, but in a various shapes, whether it's vertical or horizontal, they'll tend to make it somewhat football shaped or radial, with the brood in the center marching out and all around the edges. And then the pollen goes around the brood. Well, on a comb right in the middle, there may be very little pollen or hardly any pollen. There'll be brood at the bottom, a little bit of pollen, then honey above that, generally somewhat in an arch shape above the brood and a little bit of pollen. But on the ends, the pollen might occupy quite a few combs because that's a comb that there is very little actual brood on. It's a comb facing all the brood. It's right next to the brood, but it's the end of the brood nest. So that's the comb that tends to get a lot of pollen on it, on both ends, the rear end and the front end. And the brood tends to be this loaf-shaped structure. So the very front comb hardly has any brood. The second comb has a little bit. Third comb, quite a bit more. Fourth, fifth, and sixth comb might be fairly consistent and begins to taper off again in 3D. But the comb is kind of like a 2D slice taken through the 3D structure. And that's why there's very little pollen, often in the very middle, but there's a lot of pollen on the ends because they're putting it around the brood. But as they collapse the brood nest in the fall, they're putting pollen behind. So there's a little bit of it embedded in the honey as they eat their way through that honey during the dearth of the winter.
By the way, the BioBeekeeper on YouTube is saying they use it for queen rearing, and as an income, they can turn on and off the pollen traps on their legs to keep pollen coming in. And they also use it to see when the flows are and when things are blooming, what the timings are of the bloomings, basically.
Yeah, and that pollen trapping is very instructive because you see how quickly it changes. The bees are collecting this, and then suddenly that tapers off and they're collecting something else. And if you pay attention to that and write down dates and maybe take pictures, take samples or whatever, you can start to build a phenology, PHENOLGY, something like that, of the years plant when the flowers come into bloom and what are the flowers. Then it's a matter of going out into the field and catching the bees on the flowers and seeing them with that color pollen that you saw going in the hive. And then you begin to realize, oh, that pollen came from that plant. And then you can start to notice next year when that plant blooms, verify that and make sure that's the case. It can be very instructive to trap pollen or to at least become pollen aware as a beekeeper when they're bringing in the pollen and looking in the hive or looking in the pollen trap.
Mm-hmm. I want to say hi to Bruce from Swarmstead Bees and Gardening. He's got his own YouTube channel and he does the Might Bomb podcast. I highly recommend you check it out. He's got some good ideas on the Might Bomb podcast, especially. So if you're looking for some other info, that's one other option. Okay, so I've got Max saying that they're in Hayes County, which is where we are. And he's heard before that we have sufficient pollen for enough of the year, that there isn't a need to feed pollen patties in the early spring like you might in other places. Is that correct? We don't recommend feeding pollen patties or pollen supplements for Texas, especially because, yes, indeed, there is pollen pretty much the entire time there's a need for it. And also those pollen supplements are usually not pollen. Some instances, they might be toxic, like I think the research shows that soy-based pollen supplements are actually toxic to bees. And plus they throw off their cycles of expansion and contraction, right? So if you keep pushing them to rear brood at a time when they shouldn't be rearing brood because we're in a dearth or something like that, that can end up to catastrophic failure in some instances for various reasons. Too early in the season and you might have premature swarming at a time where there's no drones in the area to properly mate with your queens. So you're left with a virgin or poorly mated queen. They can also end up freezing to death or starving to death because they were trying to keep all that early brood warm. And in the warmer season, you can also end up with, that's more mouths to feed. So period, it goes through more nectar. I would argue personally that you end up with less honey because you're rearing more mouths that are trying to get all those carbs to go collect things. So it might be a point of diminishing returns when you're doing that anyway. And then the last problem that it can trigger sometimes is that you can end up with a small hive beetle infestation because those pollen patties sometimes attract them. And if there's any leftover that the bees haven't eaten after a few days, then those small hive beetles can reproduce in those pollen patties. So those are things to keep in mind. But with that, I would ask Les, what is your thought on that? And do you think there's enough pollen in Texas usually for the bees, and would you do anything about feeding them pollen?
Well, Natalie knows my answer.
Yeah, basically spewed most of it, didn't I?
So that's fine. And yeah, I feel like we really need to try hard to keep bees in touch with the flowers mostly. And anytime we feed artificially, it's pretty dangerous because then they can become dependent on that and you can wind up breeding bees to your feeding regime, just like we can breed bees that are antibiotic dependent or miticide dependent or disease resistant and mite resistant. We can breed bees to whatever conditions we expose them to. So if we expose them to year-round protein, they can breed themselves to be successful in their own way with that year-round protein, and then to be dependent on it. Now, when they don't get it, they're at a disservice because they got bred for that. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's kind of keeping nature natural when we just let the bees and the flowers work out their relationship, and we notice it. And then I'm against a lot of the pollen substitutes because they're not pollen. I know that, for instance, I'll get people who are raising chickens who tell me that certain time of the year, the chicken feeder or the corn feeder for the cows or whatever is full of honeybees. And they're worried that the chickens are going to get stung. Actually, that's pretty rare. And it's a very brief period of time where there isn't much pollen coming in. And the bees found that dust has a little bit of protein in it. And they'll go ahead and gather that. But I still hold off on feeding them a pollen substitute with soy and brewer's yeast or whatever. All those things are probably, well, they're not pollen. You know, we know that bees like a variety of pollen. You know, that was found out in the almond pollination, where they found that the almond growers were getting rid of mustard because they didn't want the bees on the mustard. They wanted them in the almonds. They did a quick study and they found that they pollinated the almonds better when the mustard was in bloom. And if you wonder why, it's pretty obvious. How much do you like chocolate cake? Fine, you like chocolate cake. You eat it morning, noon, and night, and pretty soon you're going to get sick of it. But if there's something else to eat, then you eat more chocolate cake because you've kind of renewed the balance of nutrition in you. And then they found that bees pollinate almonds better when there were dandelions and mustard in bloom in the orchard.
They're probably stronger and better fed and more able to grow the size of the colony because they got diversity in their diet, right?
Right. Just like people mix beans and rice all over the world because the two balance each other in protein, amino acid content. So it's the same with pollens. Bees like a variety of pollens. They don't like just one pollen. And we do them a terrible disservice when we just stick them in a bunch of almonds and try to shoot down anything but almond pollen. You know, you're actually asking them to get sick of almond pollen, literally, maybe. So I stay away from pollen substitute. And I find that the bees in Hays County, I'm in Guadalupe County, but Travis County, that they do fine. There's always enough pollen, you know, even during the middle of winter, there's a little bit of rosemary or something blooming. See an occasional bit of pollen going in. Also, their need for pollen is low if they're not raising brood. The only people that really want to bulk up their bees are the almond pollinators who get paid more if there's lots of brood in February. And that's a whole different, that's a completely unnatural system that I'm not involved in anymore.
Right. And Bruce on Swampstead Bees and Gardening says in Pennsylvania, they're using pollen patty. Them using pollen patties is like taking sand to the beach. So I think they have the similar issue. And so let's just, you know, keep in mind that pollen is probably not doing them much good, right? And we want to make sure that they follow the cycles of weather and forage anyway. And if you don't have enough food for them in the area where you're at, then maybe there's just a reason that you shouldn't have many more colonies. Maybe there's too much intensity for the area. There's too many bee colonies, not enough food for everybody. And so do we really want to keep bees in those food deserts or areas where there's not enough food? Maybe we should kind of let them self-align kind of a thing, right? I have a question from Naveen. That's the question I was mentioning earlier about sentience, I guess. I have a question that's not about pollen. You judge, given the short lifespan of worker bees, I wonder, do bees develop a collective memory of how they're being treated by their beekeeper, for example, during a hive inspection? And how does that work? Les, what's your take on that?
Yeah, people have asked me similar questions. Maybe it's a pretty in-depth the way you asked it there, but you know, a lot of the bees, when you go back in 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of the bees that were there when you went in before have passed away, and they're a whole new colony. So I don't honestly feel like they remember much of me. They may be some distant vague semblance of memory. I don't know. I mean, I have a hard enough time sometimes figuring out my own mind, let alone another human's mind, let alone another species' mind. And yet, I feel like there's so many parallels between the human existence and honeybees' existence in terms of us being a superorganism, in terms of us filling jobs and doing things together. One of the things that I know keeps the bees very coordinated in their effort to work together is the trophylactic exchange, where they constantly feed each other so that every bee, in a very slight way, is represented in the taste of that food that they exchange back and forth. The queen's pheromones are there, the brood pheromones, the flowers, bits and pieces of pheromones and scents are all infused into that. So when a bee licks from that, it's a very honest exchange. Our problem is we can't even really be honest to ourselves. We see ourselves darkly through a mirror or smoke and mirrors. And then what we present to others is maybe yet another layer of filtering. And then there's all the perception. So it's so hard to know how bees handle all that. I know that most animals are much simpler and much more straightforward, and we're more inclined to confuse ourselves with our own thoughts. But so I don't know. But I do believe that I believe in panpsychism, which is the idea that the universe is conscious and that each thing in the universe has a slight degree of consciousness. And when an individual flower knows that a bee is getting near it and can respond to the bee, that's showing something of sentience or proper response to an individual flower that doesn't even have a brain or a nerve. So we don't even know what consciousness is.
Mm. Well, and I would go a little bit further with the honeybee colonies. There's so much we don't understand. It's entirely possible that there's some mechanisms that I wouldn't say, I agree with Lass, I wouldn't say it's a personal memory because the short lifespan of the worker bees, but maybe a memory of the experience of being visited. Just the same way bees in Africa are very defensive in some instances because of the history of men poaching their nests and just kind of raiding them, and the predators destroying their colonies. The way they're putting their nests up and higher up is also a sign that somehow ancestrally they've got a sense that instinctively they know that some things are more appropriate for their self-preservation. There might be some type of, like the wax is lipophilic, but it contains a whole host of memories of pheromones and things that are said in some instances to carry some memory from generation to generation. I don't know if it's true, and I don't know if there's research proving that yet, but that's not impossible. We don't know that it's not the case, is I guess I would say.
Right, and I may add one more thing. We know that bees can sense electromagnetic fields, very small, weak ones, on the fur on their thorax. Mm-hmm. And this study's been done fairly recently again in Israel, where they showed that the bees could register the electromagnetic field of a flower, which is pretty weak, on the bee's thorax. So that brings up the whole concept of, do bee hives develop an electromagnetic field where the bees in the hive get coherent, because each bee has their own small electromagnetic field. So can they get coherent in a beehive? And do we disrupt that when we take the beehive apart and they have to regenerate it, get it back in sync once we've left them alone? And is there consciousness on that level as a group in that coherent electromagnetic field? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. but I'm open to lots of, I sort of feel like nature's so amazing and beautiful. And I trust that it's wiser. We're part of it, and we're going to learn how to be wiser in it instead of against it.
And being humble in that concept, and realizing that we don't know all the answers. But to Les's point, that might not be a memory at the individual bee level, but maybe potentially at the superorganism group level, that memory might be there. And you got to remember, it's been proven that some bees can do math, right? So where does it stop? Where does that memory start? I mean, you got to have some type of memory to do math, right? So something to be said about that. Food for thoughts anyway. And let's go back to the food subject of our evening. Appreciate the question, Naveen. You had us going down our favorite, subjects of what it is that we don't know about bees and how amazing they are. You had another question. You're the next one up. If bees embed pollen into the honey in the fall, is it important to harvest your honey before the bees start doing that, or does it not matter less?
No, that I wouldn't worry about that. So bees store the pollen pretty much to itself around the brood nest, and then they soak it with a little bit of honey, just not so that it's full, the cell has a bunch of honey in it. It's mostly got pollen in it, but it's soaked in honey just to make it acidic and keep potentially maybe air out of it or whatever, so that it's just lightly soaked in honey. And that's to help preserve the pollen. And if you let the bees collapse their brood nest in the fall, they'll naturally put it behind the brood nest, and then it gets smaller, they put it behind the brood nest. So it winds up on this comb, a little bit on this comb. And then in the winter, when they're eating their way through, they'll break into little bits of pollen here and there. And they don't need very much in the winter because they're not raising hardly any brood. But they'll have that little bit that they left behind. What I don't recommend, and I used to see this, well, somebody recommended, that you go in there and rearrange the combs dramatically in the late fall. Bees have arranged those combs to their liking for ways that we may not understand. So I try to leave the combs pretty much alone. I decide, okay, I'm going to leave the 10 combs for the bees, and I'm not going to rearrange it once we get into late in the fall, because I figure the bees have arranged them the way they like them, so they can hit that honey and a little bit of pollen as they need to. Because once it gets cold, they can't get out of the cluster and go get some pollen over there. They have to stay in the cluster until it warms up. Now here in Texas, it's not likely to stay cold for more than a week, but still we want them to have access to pollen. Just let them store their comb the way they want, and don't try to second guess. Like I had a guy that said, oh, you should try to look for pollen and arrange it every other comb. Well, don't worry about that. The bees stored that pollen the way they know how to store it, and trust them to do that well, and let them alone.
Yep. So very good question again, Naveen. And this is our 5-minute reminder that we're going to do this until 8:30 p.m. Central. So if you have any questions, ask them. I've got a question from Sherry. She says she's planting bee-friendly flowers as fast as she can. But in your experience, do bees like the Texas juniper pollen or live oak pollen? They don't use that very much, right, Les?
I've never seen bees in New Mexico, California, or Texas use the cedar pollen. Now, in plants have two ways of getting pollinated, wind or insect. And the wind pollen is quite a bit different from insect pollen. Wind pollen is very small, very light, and generally has a couple of little wings so it can fly. So when the breeze blows, it just puffs and billows through the air for miles until it gets on our nose and makes us hack and cough. But its goal isn't to make us hack and cough. Its goal is to hope that some of it lands on female flowers downwind of that particular species. But most of that wind pollinated pollen lands on the dirt or the water, or places where it doesn't do any good. Insect pollen is made for insects to digest. It is built with little Velcro clingy things all over it. So when the insect touches it, it clings to the insect. And then the insect carries it to the next tree of that same species to help cross-pollinate that species tree. So it's very targeted to make that pollen, and the insect carries it to a flower of that same species to drop it off. So they have to make near as much, but they make plenty because they want to feed the bees. Nature works it out where the bees get to eat a lot of rich pollen, the plant gets pollinated, and if it's an apple tree, we get to eat the apple, and we distribute the seeds for the apple because we pick the apple, carry it far away, or a bear eats the apple and poops out the seed far away. Everybody wins. Nature isn't about competition. It's about cooperation. It's a win, 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 win. If we could work with nature, we would see the earth getting richer and more full of plants and animals instead of poorer. So we need to learn from nature and nature of bees to become more cooperative with nature instead of antagonistic with all of our various asides, fungicides, miticides, insecticides, pesticides. They're all just poison.
Yes. So, and then that's something we need to be mindful of. I have a question from Mac. He says, if the bees have pollen left from the prior year, will they end up using that pollen later if it's not immediately adjacent to the brood area? Or does the new season's brood nest have to grow into the old pollen area before the bees will use it? And remember that pollen is kind of like, it's hard to remove it unless they consume it, right?
Right. Last year's pollen becomes kind of a dead weight once they start bringing in fresh new pollen.
So you just pull it out?
Yeah, if there's a lot of it, if there's a little bit of it, I've seen the bees chipping away at the cell and finally toss it out themselves. But I found it out in the front of the hive, with little bits and pieces of it. So they can clean a little bit of it out. You have a big thick comb of it, I'd probably just pull that comb out and let them build a new comb, because last year's pollen isn't much good to them once there's fresh new pollen coming in.
Right. Well, and there's a point where if there's too much of it, maybe, and especially in the warmer areas, it might become an issue with the small hive beetles if they're not going to use it at all, right? There's something I wanted to mention. I knew I wanted to circle back to was entombed pollen. Les, have you heard of that? Where they basically seal off with a coat of wax pollen that might be, in theory, from what I've researched, basically contaminated with fungicides. Is that something you've heard at entombed pollen?
I've heard people talk about it. I've not actually seen it.
I've seen it.
You have seen it. There are various asides that can ruin pollen. There was a insecticide back in the 50s, 60s, 60s and 70s that was microencapsulated in plastic. The bees picked up as if it were pollen and stored, and then it broke open and killed all the bees. And we finally got it banned, but it took 10 years of railing against it, but we finally got it banned. So, yeah, I mean, we have to try to clean up this world and help them not get contaminated pollen.
I've seen the entombed pollen sometimes in colonies that are actually struggling. So there might be a correlation there, and that might be an indicator. Sometimes there's an issue with contamination. And if the health of the colony is looking like it's going down, you might want to consider removing that comb altogether and giving them either fresh worker comb or just let them grow again if they're strong enough. but they're not, once it's entombed, they're not going to use it. And again, it's usually on older comb that's probably already contaminated with fungicides and pesticides and things over time. But that's basically they seal it off and it's not to be used ever again. So I find it very interesting as a behavior from the bees.
You know, fungicides have been shown to kill good fungus and give bad fungus more rain. I remember somebody growing bananas in the Costa Rica saying they're having trouble with a black Cicatoga fungus killing banana trees. This was Dole banana, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And they were working on what to do about it. And the lady told them, you need to grow mycorrhizal good fungus to protect your trees from the bad fungus. Fungicides are actually making it worse. So we could be getting bad fungus in our pollen when they get contaminated with fungicide. That gets rid of the good fungus that the bees use, and then the bad fungus takes over.
Mm-hmm. And with those thoughts, we thank you for joining us again on the Monday night, 7:30 to 8:30 Central, like every Monday. Please tell your friends, come on back next Monday. If you cannot get in on Zoom, we're doing it live on YouTube as well. The recording will be on our YouTube channel at Be Mindful. If you have questions, you can email them to us like Sarita did, and we can deal with them during the show, or use earlier, respond to you directly if it's an emergency, especially. Be Mindful Honey Farms at gmail.com or on our website, be-mindful.com. And with that, thank you so much again. And Les, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your years of experience with bees.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for setting everything up in your addition to it. And everybody, see y'all next week, and good talking to you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Brad. Bye.
Bye.
Oops.